Hello, listeners, and welcome to another archive episode from the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I'm Alex Sargent.
And I'm Chris Holliday.
Right, this time we're travelling back to, I believe, we recorded this at a Society of Animation Studies conference a few years ago up in Middlesbrough.
We did.
But that doesn't really give you any sense of the flavour of what we're talking about, because we're speaking about Pixar's Inside Out with Eric Herhuth, who is not from Middlesbrough or animated. So in no way did that give a sense of, I think. But it was a great episode.
Yes, it was a great episode. So, yeah, episode 107, I think from a couple of years ago, recorded live amongst a batch of episodes that we wanted to get the great and the good of animation studies to talk to. So I think this is absolutely one of those episodes. Eric's written a lot on Pixar and computer animation, and so we wanted a different set of eyes, different perspective on Inside Out. And I think, if I remember rightly, this was also recorded maybe before the sequel. I can't quite remember.
Yeah, it probably was. I'm not sure if it had been announced. Maybe we talk about that on the episode. But
we should listen. We should listen back and see if we do.
Why don't we listen in a sec? We'll listen along with everyone else. And make sure. But yes, certainly now the sequel's come out and done so phenomenally well. It'd be interesting to see whether the thoughts we had in this episode map onto the sequel nicely, or whether it kind of changes things or alters things. You were really, if I remember right, you were a bit grumpy on Inside Out. Have you changed over the years, or are you still quite grumpy on it?
Well, am I grumpy about Inside Out? I mean, I still think The Good Dinosaur is an underrated classic of the Pixar canon. This film, again, one of those rare instances where Pixar produced two films in the same year. This one got a lot of the plaudits because of kind of what it does and how it does it, and the story, which is wonderful. I do have a love of The Good Dinosaur for various reasons, but hey, this is, if we're talking about the peaks and troughs of Pixar animation studios, and maybe they haven't quite hit the heights of that first sort of golden age period of the studio's animated features, this is probably one of those return to Pixar know what they're doing, they can tell a good story, and no surprise that we've had a sequel since. So definitely something, I think students write a lot about Inside Out. I think anthropomorphizing feelings, what happens when feelings have feelings. I think it's a great movie, and perhaps not as grumpy as I once was.
Okay, well, let's travel back in time to a moment where Pixar hadn't lost their mojo, and indeed we hadn't lost ours, and check in on Inside Out.
Hi listeners, welcome to the latest episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast with me, Chris Holliday.
And me, Alex Sargent. Somewhere between disgust and anger today, or maybe joy and sadness.
Okay, so we're doing Inside Out, we're doing Pixar, we're doing Inside Out, a film that I have a kind of, in the spirit of filming about emotions, I have a love-hate relationship with. It's an instance where Pixar released two computer-animated films the same year. It's only happened a couple of times. I think Coco and Cars 3 was the last time, but 2015 produces Good Dinosaur, and then this film, Inside Out, I think generally considered to be the, I guess, quote-unquote, better of the two films, though perhaps we can talk about that. And certainly really interesting. I think it's certainly more kind of conceptual, cerebral than the Good Dinosaur, and touches on what would it be like if feelings had feelings. So I've certainly used it in my teaching to talk about animated representation, characterization, personality, that sort of stuff. And I guess for you, there's plenty of stuff on dreams and fantasy and embodiment, right?
Yeah. I like this movie a lot. I'm sure there are problems with it we can dissect and go over, and it's not a perfect movie, but it got me straight away when I first saw it. It's one of my favourite Pixar movies.
Really?
So I'm really, and it fits within a genre we've already talked about on the podcast before, of like that kind of fantasy body comedy of we've done Osmosis Jones just a couple of episodes ago, and things like Inner Space and the British institution, the Numbskull. So I'm well on board and happy to talk about it.
Great.
Luckily, it won't just be us, Chris.
No, this is a great opportunity actually to get someone on the podcast whose work has certainly been both, I think, in terms of his research. A touchstone for my own interest in computer animated films, and also just looking at his selected publications. I was telling him before we started that I teach all of them, so not just myself but my students are very familiar with his work on caricature and politics. So this is Eric Herhuth, who is a assistant professor in communication at Tulane University. Eric's work kind of traverses a number of issues related to animation, I think aesthetics, politics. He's written on the politics of animation, which I use when I teach animation and politics. He's written on caricature and this notion of kind of overloading, which I think is kind of fascinating in a world where we always ask our students to unpack. I think overloading is a really interesting way of thinking about caricature. And then perhaps, I guess, most famously, his book from 2017, Pixar and the Aesthetic Imagination, which sits on my shelf, and I know it sits on a number of other animation studies scholars' shelves as well. So Pixar and the Aesthetic Imagination, animation, storytelling, and digital culture. So Eric, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Chris. Alex, this is a real privilege.
Well, no, it's a privilege for us, and it's a privilege to talk to you about the Inside Out as well. So I guess just let's set up where the conversation might go. Where Inside Out, it's an important movie in Pixar. Well, for some, it's an important movie in Pixar's canon. It's also sort of, slightly, it's kind of towards the tail end of this golden age of Pixar. We seem to be coming through.
Ooh, we can talk about that.
Oh God, all right. I said something controversial. I didn't even mean to. How does Inside Out fit within your kind of broader interests in Pixar? And what's your sort of thoughts on the movie to kick us off?
Yeah, it's a good question because I was thinking about this. I watched it a little while ago, and the way that I read Pixar films, I read them quite often as like political allegories, right?
Yeah.
I try to find, what values or ideologies, do the films represent narratively or in the characters. And Inside Out was almost too explicit, but also a little confusing in this way, right? The emotion characters, there's explicit metaphors. The mind, Riley's mind, the character Riley, her mind is this vast space. It's kind of container. So like everything seems to be metaphorical. So I'm like, oh, this should be easy as a political allegory. Like what are the values and ideologies behind it?
Yeah.
And then I start to like dig into that a little bit. And there's some parts that are clear, other parts I'm not so sure. So that's something I thought we might.
Yeah,
absolutely, yeah.
Because I know, because obviously your book kind of takes a kind of case study approach, looking at specific Pixar films, and I guess the way that these things work is that, and the nature of publication is that the film kind of comes, if the book comes out 2017, this film's kind of on the edge of when you're wrapping things up. But it would be good to get a sense of a kind of couple of examples of for readers, or for listeners who are not familiar with your work on Pixar and the aesthetic imagination. Give us an example of your kind of political reading. So I know you've written on Ratatouille, you've written on WALL-E. Kind of a flavour, I guess, of a way, an Eric Herhuth approach to computer animated films.
Yeah. I mean, this is nice. I think, to put it succinctly, what I often find in animated films, and I'll defer to Chris on what a computer animated film is, but what I often find is that it amplifies a certain kind of dialectic that we find a lot in art more generally, which is that you'll kind of enter into a created space, an artificial world, if you will, where it seems that the rules of that world might be at play, kind of up in the air. You're introduced to them, it's not sure what they're going to be, but in that world, you find it actually to be fairly traditional, conventional, highly normative, actually, even though it doesn't have to be. So my first article, which represents this, I think, quite well, was about the film WALL-E. So it's about robots, it's about the future, it's a sort of post-apocalyptic kind of setting. The Earth is gone. And yet, what do the robot characters sort of learn to do in this film? They sort of stray from their programming. They, develop a kind of desire for freedom and to be free. The robot WALL-E learns to, heterosexual desire to want to couple with another robot. So while you're in this space where things could be radically different, they're not that different.
Yeah.
And so I think that's something that we find in a lot of animated films. Pixar films seem to do that in interesting ways. And, to be clear, when I do these sort of dialectical readings, I don't want to be so cynical that I say, well, there's nothing really optimistic or, there's no sincere expression of the possible.
Yeah.
I actually think there is. I think there is an expression of like real possibility and radical change and rethinking things conceptually, different forms of embodiment and this sort of thing. But, at the same time, Pixar films do what I think a lot of Hollywood productions that are meant to be, that are designed for mass audiences, they're kind of inherently conservative, right? There's only so much they do in that regard.
So you've hit on what I like to call on the podcast the Wizard of Oz problem, and that's the reference done for the week, so I don't have to think of a way to get that into the conversation again. But the Wizard of Oz problem being that, in a world where a film can be about a completely alternative world, why is a film like The Wizard of Oz about home, right? And the dialectic that I think when I read your book and I'm seeing the way you are, it's a really useful methodology because what it does is it highlights the contradictions without trying to necessarily completely resolve them into a neat bow. And I think, The Wizard of Oz and fantasy and imaginative storytelling often has this space for quite a dialectic because The Wizard of Oz is a film about home. It's an incredibly conservative movie, but it's also a movie in which if you just take it on the level of sensation and aesthetics and the sensorium of the movie, that's all in quite a radical space. It's all in the kind of other, the alternative, the approaching the new, the approaching the different, the subversive, the queer in some cases, depending on how you read all the spaces of Oz. Fine, the film ends with the line, "There's no place like home," but one's relationship to that movie and people's relationship to the movie can be very subversive and can be used in a very progressive manner. So is that a tension when we talk about these kind of works of popular mass art, in that they have to be on one level incredibly hegemonic and within the kind of structures of power, otherwise they don't get released and don't get made and
released,
and enjoyed by so many people from so many different political and persuasions, but also they have to be highly imaginative and rich and have that sensorial impact, and that in itself can kind of do things that maybe the narrative isn't doing or is contrary to some of the things the narrative is saying, because aesthetics kind of are a bit more unwieldy than that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And what it reminds me of actually is when I was doing research for the Pixar book, I kept, I was watching lots of interviews with John Lasseter, right? And, and reading sort of interviews. And one of the things that I found him kind of saying over and over again was that, in 1995 when Toy Story comes out, and then when they were doing the shorts before that, computer animation was very new. And so Lasseter was always thinking about, how do we kind of, do something that's new but also familiar, right? And so, introducing people to computer animation, but through stories, narratives, characters, worlds that are somewhat familiar. And so I think that logic of new and familiar actually kind of fits really well with that, the Wizard of Oz problem you were just sort of talking to, and how does a company produce a product that's going to have mass appeal and be accepted in many contexts, but also be very creative and imaginative. So I see that there being a kind of fit there and that sort of balance.
Yeah, no, I agree.
So bringing the conversation to Inside Out, I guess, what's the tension or what's the dialectic that we could play with in that movie? If we're talking about Pixar as this site for innovation, but also of conservatism and this kind of political political conservatism with a small c, or a big C, depending on what your reading of the film is, stylistic innovation. How's that playing out in Inside Out?
Yeah, I mean, it might be a little less conservative in some senses. This is what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Mainly because, if the kind of lesson of the film is to, learn to accept sadness or to learn to appreciate sadness for what it brings to interpersonal relationships, forming bonds with others, developing sympathy, learning to kind of accept your emotions and let them unfold over time instead of repressing them. If that's the lesson on one hand, that's, kind of familiar, but on the other, I'm thinking it's also kind of critical if we're thinking about its cultural context. It's a U.S. Hollywood production, being one in which, and this is what the film kind of suggests explicitly, there's an obsession with sort of achieving happiness, maintaining one's sense of joy, right? And kind of always being happy, right? And even this reminds me of the world of the mind that's inside the character Riley. That world is supposed to be fun. It kind of, the islands of personality have an amusement park quality to them. And so to me, there's, this kind of emphasis on fun, joy, and then, of course, the arc of the film is that, that's some, misguided, and it's not sort of leading to proper like emotional development. Now I think we can kind of say is this proper emotional development that we're sort of witnessing? What sort of standards is that sort of adhering to? But I think that's the general kind of way that it's often read, right? Is that sort of the lesson of it?
Yeah. So I guess it's I mean, I'm in two minds. I mean, I think it's very incredibly emotionally effective, and I think the film's embrace of sadness is hard to be too cynical about, because I think it's an important thing. But it does. I guess I'm wondering what that is, because on one hand it seems almost like a sort of political statement about kind of, I don't know, the neoliberalism or even the American project, right? The pursuit of happiness being at the heart of a kind of building of the modern nation. And this film is like, well, no, that's what Joy's spending most of the movie. Like the character of Joy is spending most of the movie doing her best to pursue happiness at all costs. And the lesson of the movie is actually, that pursuit is in itself the problem, right? That seems kind of radical. But then is what this film is therefore saying that kind of, is it also a film that, like, would you teach it on a, resilience in the workplace course, right? Which is also like, oh my God, how dare you? And maybe the problem is it sets up joy and sadness as the two options, right? And actually trivializes, well, one, there's loads of other emotions that the film doesn't bother to or finds difficult to get into the story, but also they've got, fear, anger, and disgust, who are trivialized as kind of comic sidekicks. And actually, I would argue there's quite a lot about the world to be fearful, angry, and disgusted about, that the film doesn't offer a similar space for those emotions to kind of be given the same importance in that kind of schema.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Yeah, and I mean, so the film is basically kind of like a buddy movie between joy and sadness. So, what is always or tends to be disappointing about that formulation is that there's an inevitable bond between the two that it feels inevitable. Like that resolution comes. So in that sense, what about those other emotions? And I mean, I was reading some reviews of the film, right? And there's a lot of people study emotions, and neuroscientists who are kind of object to the number of emotions. These are the 5 core ones that everybody seems to talk about, but it's not as simple as that.
No.
Right?
Yeah.
And so there's this whole discourse about like what does the simplification of emotional processing, even if the film's about like accepting one's emotions, what are we doing when we sort of present a simple picture of that? Or I mean,
I'm interested in the notion of simplicity, because I wonder, I don't know, I love the movie. And I wonder one of the reasons, I don't know, Chris, I'm anticipating why you don't like the movie, but I've heard you say in the past it's either incoherent or it doesn't make sense or you don't get it. And I would argue what I would accept is that the conceptualization, the metaphor the film's playing with, and the way it kind of presents the body as, the world in which Riley's kind of external behavior manifests, seems almost deliberately fuzzy to me. Like I would struggle now to articulate exactly what the system that the film is offering.
Yeah.
You've got these kind of 5 core emotions. They drive the core memory. Memory is really important. I think that is an interesting thing to think about. But memory is really important to the kind of personality of Riley. There's these core memories. There's these islands of memory. That then there's also trains of thought and all this sort of stuff. So I wonder, sort of, when you say that it's simple, I do wonder how much that's the debate. How much that is supposed to be kind of as neat. Is it supposed to be a neatly articulate, coherent metaphor for the human experience? Because if it is, it isn't very good at it. But I'm not convinced. Is it, Chris? What do you?
Okay. So first of all, I think
he's picked up his notepad. Everybody, I'm scared.
Oh
God!
It's just a series of notes about why The Good Dinosaur's a more effective film. No. First of all, I think Eric's point about the inevitability of joy and sadness, I think, is really striking, and given the downplaying of the other 3 emotions, fear, disgust, and anger, it's interesting that you'd argue that given the film was released in 2015, you could fast forward a couple of years and the film should really be about, if we think about Trump-era America, it should really be about fear, disgust, and anger. So actually the film would look very different in a post-Trump America or a Trump-era America, let's say.
That's Inside Out 2.
Yeah. Back in anger. I don't know. That was just riffing. But I think conceptually the film is super interesting. And actually, I know that within the next 45 minutes to an hour, I'm going to love it more than I do by virtue of the fact we're talking about it. So I think the tension in the film is between the characters controlling Riley versus the characters being reflective of Riley. So there are instances where Sadness says, "I'll drive," and then there's the assumption that, and in fact discussed... Sadness says, "I'll drive," with the assumption that they are controlling using this control panel. But if that's the case, the characters themselves don't need to be emotions. They could be anyone. They could be the builders, the factory workers that put the control panel together, because if they're just pressing the buttons, then they don't need to be emotions themselves. And yet another instance is says to the characters, "Be happy," as if they're now their behaviour is reflective of Riley. And the film can't make up its mind whether they are just conduits or people playing a video game, essentially they are controlling the movements, or whether their own actions are the feelings and emotions of Riley. And the film is a little bit fuzzy on that, I think. So it's a kind of a minor thing, but I did notice it when I was watching. Well, it's not a minor thing; it's the thing that haunts me. But
I don't know.
It's just an interesting way of thinking about. I guess it's an interesting way of thinking about emotions, because if they do control Riley and therefore they don't need to be emotions themselves, it's an interesting decision that the filmmakers took to isolate, I think, or narrow down 27 emotions that they had down to 5. Thank you, IMDb Trivia, for that. To narrow it down to those 5, which I think goes back to Eric's point about the inevitability of joy and sadness being, of course, they're linked. And the film plays with that memory that joy flicks between the two. Actually, joy and sadness are interlinked, and you need them both. Whereas it seems fear, disgust, and anger are a little bit more complex and more nuanced. And maybe the film would be more successful, for me, if it focused on those emotions a little bit more. I don't know. It's just that's one of the things I always remember at the film. Are they reflective of Riley through their behaviour and what they do, or are they just controlling Riley? That was my kind of thought.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I like what you were saying about the emotion characters not really being emotions. They're,
because they also exhibit other emotions.
Yeah.
So fear is angry, and angry gets disgust, and disgust gets sad. So it seems a bit fuzzy in that sense, but maybe it's a cynical merchandising strategy to get people to buy fear.
No, I actually think it was a good choice to design the characters and characterize them that way.
Yeah.
Because I think it adds a kind of complexity to what emotions are. I was always thinking, so the character fear, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just fear. He's like anxiety. He's like angst. He's like all these things, right? And and it's not just sort of fear in the reactive sense, like you see something and get scared. No,
it's preemptive.
Yeah. He anticipates bad things happening.
Yeah,
he's preparing for the first day of school, and he's got all this stuff. So in that way, he's not just fear. He's like this range of affects. Same thing with like the other characters, anger. My favorite is disgust, because there's nothing really disgusting about her. She actually looks like kind of great.
Yeah.
And
she just looks a little bit like broccoli.
Just a little bit like broccoli. But, I broccoli looks kind of cool.
Yeah.
I don't really understand.
Who doesn't love roasted broccoli? Or any kind of broccoli?
But, so disgust is not disgusting. And really, she kind of represents taste and judgment. She cares about fashion. She cares about appearing before others. These sort of things. So I think, while it seems like an inconsistency or a contradiction, I think what it does do is it helps with the problem of reducing things to 5 emotions, right? To give it, a sense that, there is some dynamism to the sort of range of emotions that one has. I mean, that said, they do still feel like they're driven by like a core kind of program, that the characters are. Right, they are distinct. It's not like anger ever acts like fear necessarily. They're distinct enough.
Yes,
right?
yes, and distinct through voice work, through character design, as you said. So we've got one looking a little bit like a raw nerve. So fear is designed. Bill Hader's character is designed like a raw nerve, or like a synapse. Broccoli, disgust, anger, I guess like a volcano because he seems to spout fire and Joy's the one I can't pin down because Joy is not reduced to one colour.
Tinkerbell with some blue
hair. Marge Simpson.
I think conceptually a star was
right.
You know, because like in the abstract thought segment where she breaks down and becomes more pointed.
Yes, and that good point, because actually sadness then becomes more like a teardrop.
Right.
I guess. So actually, I think all of this is particularly important given that the protagonist is also 11 turning into 12, and of course the final bit of the film is a kind of play on what is this button, puberty. Oh, I'm sure that's not important. And so actually all of this, this is the story of a girl, 11-year-old girl who is moved out of her house, or moved from Minnesota to, oh goodness, I've blanked on where she moved to. San Francisco. And so it's all about her alienation, her relationship with her parents, her relationship with her, well, I was going to say relationship with her friends, but she kind of has one friend that she talks to online and some new friends at the new school. She plays hockey, so relationship, her ability to, it's interesting that her emotions dictate the way that her skill set, that she can't play hockey now. But anyway, so this is just I think the film is a lot more interesting to talk about, actually, and kind of dissect.
But isn't that about the dynamism that Eric's pointing out? Like, to me, like, this is a rant I've gone on a few times on this podcast, but I'll do it one more time.
Why not?
One more for the road. Which is that, like, like the thorny and complicated relationship between kind of fantasy, metaphor, and allegory, and like this, what role does the imagination have? If fantasy storytelling is supposed to trigger, provoke, and stimulate the imagination, what is the role of allegory in that relationship? Because quite often it's seen as complementary, right? And it can be seen as conflicting or complementary, in that allegory is often used as a strategy to legitimize fantasy fiction. Hey, it's not just a story about some crazy characters. It's about her emotions. Toy Story isn't just about some toys. It's about the family. Children growing up, whatever the allegory you want to apply in there. Lord of the Rings isn't just about Middle-earth, it's about the atomic bomb or World War II or whatever you want to throw into it. And on one hand, that has been very successful, but on the other hand, it means that the story only seems to matter for the figurative displacement that you can offer in as a replacement for the literal fantasy of it. So I've tried to, in some of my work, I've tried to think through, like, why is the tendency to allegorize so in part of the process, and can it be part of the pleasure of fantasy? And the only way I can sort of think about it is it only works as part of the pleasure of fantasy if there's a messiness to it, or a hesitation to it, or a kind of, I think it's Benjamin who sort of talks about allegory as a kind of the ruin that the literal leaves behind, or whatever. It reminds you of the literal, but it doesn't offer an alternative. It's about a displacement or a disjunct rather than offering a solid alternative. And I think that's, if we're struggling to go, oh, okay, the film is about this bit is this and this bit is this, and we could find a really easy, clear. If it was Animal Farm is not interested in the imaginative quality of the pigs. It's interested in just distilling. Eric's not sure about that, but I would argue Animal Farm is not about. Go. Would you disagree, or?
Just in the sort of what's funny about your formulation is that it was starting to get a little bit more absolute than I think you would like, right?
Sure,
you're
right,
sure. Like Animal Farm.
Could Animal Farm be about? Could you read the Animal Farm? There must be a way of reading Animal Farm and reading it as an imaginative story about pigs. Otherwise, what the hell's the?
Yeah,
it's not about pigs. But it is about pigs.
This is your point, right? Like the idea of allegory being that it kind of narrows or restricts interpretation. Yeah. That you sort of decode it according to some, system. Yeah. Or something.
Yeah, like exactly that. Right? And what role imagination plays on that? Because if the imagination is about liberating and freeing and creativity, it's not very creative to kind of have to read something in an alternative way. So I like the messiness of the world of Inside Out, because it makes me, every time I watch it, do a bit of allegorization and a little bit of metaphorization and try to kind of pick the two worlds together. But there's always a kind of energy and a dynamism left, because it doesn't quite match together or it doesn't fill in the holes completely.
Yeah. I mean, so on the topic of this messiness, let's talk a little bit about the structure of inside Riley's mind. So the film, if we can, but the film begins with her as a child or as a baby, and my first note is actually So Joy walks out of the darkness, I think, when she's a child. The character Riley opens her eyes and sees her parents, and we see from inside her skull. Let's say, I think let's go with that.
It's true. Her mind is a container. I feel like that's the basic metaphor.
Okay, so her mind is... So I was trying to figure out, is Joy as new to this role? Does Joy come into being at the same point as Riley? Is Joy... This is...
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because that would mean that the default position of the human subject is Joy.
Joy comes first, but also...
And then the world gets in the way.
Is Joy as new to this as Riley? Does Joy come into being going, right, well, all I need to do now is wait for the control panel to arrive. So I was sort of interested in Joy being the default, slowly joined by the others. And I can't remember the order. I imagine the order is probably important. The order in which they appear. There's probably something really interesting. Does sadness come first?
Yeah. It goes joy and sadness.
Yeah.
After that, I can't remember.
Which is sort of, I think, is the inevitability of them ending up together. I think.
And what you're saying about actually a lot of the other, the other emotions seem to embody lots of different things that actually are harder to articulate, and even like the core things of like disgust. That's a very complex emotion, actually. I would say. Like, I think anger, fine, but fear, fine, but actually fear, So there's all that as well.
Well, the stuff Eric was saying about the kind of the range of affects. So not only is fear is preemptive, but disgust is invested in kind of taste and judgment, which I think is right. So so it's as much socialization as it is emotion. She's being socialised into the world because she learns about its structures, and this then enables her to buy a ticket on a bus. Anyway, so we have joy kind of coming to being as the first emotion, quickly followed by the others. But in terms of the structure, you have these memories that are organised into a kind of vast library. You have the core memories, which are the main events, the key frames, rather than the in-betweens, let's say, the key frames. But those core memories power these islands of personality. And there was something that I found... The cynic in me is, well, this is also just a brilliant advert for Disneyland. This is what the film is. It's about go to Disneyland and enjoy all these range of... and so I was just interested in what people thought about the decision to make it kind of theme park-esque and what that does, given what we've talked about, business, America, happiness, happiest place on earth. The most joyful place on earth is Disneyland. And so I'll be interested to hear kind of people's thoughts on that, because I think the decision to make it theme parky is sort of maybe interesting, and if you had thoughts on that.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if it's interesting.
I'm so cynical. I'm so sorry.
No, because the cynicism, I think, is really obvious. Like, it reminds me of those arguments that you find scholars or critics making, where like our imagination has been so penetrated by like capitalism that you can't imagine anything else. Right? You know what I mean? So it's like, no wonder Riley's mind is full of this kind of, theme park-esque looking theme. She has a Dream Productions is like this, her dreams are this entertainment studio.
That's really
right?
interesting.
The
capitalism of her mind.
So so I think it's almost, it's, it's obvious, it's kind of blatant, but again, I think the other connection is that there's this emphasis on fun and pleasure in the sort of mindscape, if you will. Of course, this contrasts with the dump where the memories go to die. Mm-hmm. And the subconscious, which is dark and dismal. But for the rest of it, it's like this high-tech, entertaining, vast space of like fun and cool-looking
color
landscape. The color scheme.
Let's talk about the subconscious. I feel like you'll have a good representation of the subconscious, because it's a film all about the mind. It's people write about how we've talked about this before, how cinema is like the mind. It operates like the mind edits. We think in edits, we think in jump cuts, we think in, this is Alsasser talking about cinema as mind. So subconscious, this is a film all about, the fantasy in you must have just been all off the scale.
I'm thinking, I mean, as I say, also as the film gets on and the buddy movie narrative starts, the desire to kind of try to conceptualize it, as I say, it's a thorny thing, because when they're riding the train of thought, all these kind of ideas that sound very metaphorical but actually don't seem very coherent in terms of, so what they're doing this and she's doing that, and I don't, as you say, actually it's that question of driving and inhabiting, because our fear and sadness absent from the whole equation. Are there actions within the body irrelevant to Riley's actions while they're out of the
It would seem so.
Booth?
It would seem so, yeah.
Or are what they're supposed to be doing, that when they destroy memories, surely memories are destroyed, and when all that kind of stuff. The consequence of it all is interesting to think about. But But I would say, actually, I think there is something nuanced about it. It's not who's driving and who's not driving, because what it's trying to articulate, I think, is that kind of, well, there's that lovely gag, isn't there, about, oh God, we've got these opinions and these facts mixed up. Oh well, they're sort of the same anyway, and they put them back in either box. And I think that's what it's trying to articulate. And there's a difference between feeling angry and consciously acting on one's anger. Yeah.
Right.
And when anger is going like, what we should do? That's anger in, the anger that we suppress on a daily basis when we're trying to be civilized people and things annoy us. But there's, okay, I'm going to act on this. And I think that's an interesting, or that's the way it kind of tries to get through it. I don't know. So that's an act of, and therefore the film is kind of dealing with acts of repression quite a lot, in that Joy is trying to repress. Joy actually isn't trying to be joyful. Joy is trying to repress sadness.
Yeah, and I think this is a good point about agency in the film, right? And it's complicated because Riley's an 11-year-old girl, and I think at some point we need to talk about like gender. Sure. At some point we can come back to that. Yeah. But she's learning that she can't actually control her emotions, right? And I think it's amazing that
that her emotions can't control her.
Right. It's
because they get shunted or removed or repressed or. So that's where I'm sort of interested. Is the film about Riley and her inability to control her emotions, or is it about how emotions are just up in the air and the outcome is what happens to Riley? Anyway.
I mean, it's probably too easy to say it's both.
It's both.
But what I do like about this kind of complication is what it sort of says about depression as maybe like a mood that sort of has a long duration. And so that when you're in a particular state of mind or mood, only certain emotions are available to you. You don't know where the other ones went necessarily. All you know is that you're angry, you get, disgusted with things, you're just like sensitive and irritable, right? As opposed to having like a full range of emotions. Yeah. Like only a few things are available to you. And then, and I do appreciate the kind of films like presentation of the alienated feeling of suddenly being self-conscious about, your emotions or inability to control those things, right? You have feelings, you start crying, you don't want to cry, but you can't help it, right? It's that kind of thing that I think the film does present in an interesting way, because on one hand, Riley is sort of a character, not necessarily the protagonist, but she's also the setting. Right? And so, so, we're like just able to take this kind of impossible view inside her mind, but she's cut off from all that. Yeah. Right? And I think it's that alienation of just not really having access to like the details of your own emotions that are interesting. And again, this lesson of like just accepting them or something as opposed to repressing them.
Yeah. Where's the space for sort of consciousness and rationality and intellect and...
I think they left that out.
Yeah. Well, that's a big problem, isn't it?
I'm just thinking about I think the issue. Maybe this is a good point to talk about gender. Actually, the fact that she's this 11 soon. Well, she's 12 by the end of the film, I think, isn't she? The voiceover Joy at the end says she's now 12, and what what's the worst that could happen? Something like that. So kind of partner with the puberty joke as well.
Reminds me of the sort of, what's the end line of Toy Story? It's a puppy, like.
Exactly. Mrs. Potato Head. Yeah, is it saying that 11-year-old girls are just driven by emotion, and that intellect is something that's not at least available, or the film's just not interested? Maybe this is a good point to reflect a little bit on gender and kind of thoughts about choosing an 11-year-old girl quite specifically to articulate some of these ideas.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, one thing that I read that's sort of explicit is that Pete Docter had his own daughter in mind, right? That he's partly inspired by that. And so there is this idea of kind of watching your child sort of lose some of that childhood and that childishness. And so I think it is interesting, though, to think about there's a history of Pixar sort of having male-directed and male-centered films, and so, having a perspective of maybe a father perspective of the 11-year-old girl sort of developing. And then, and I think a lot of people kind of comment on the glimpse inside the parents' minds, and in addition to Riley's mother being driven by sadness and her father driven by anger, their emotions are much more uniform in appearance, right?
And they all the men have got moustaches. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah. And so I think one available reading is that, at the moment, Riley's emotions are a bit more diverse than that. They don't look quite as uniform. They're not dressed all the same. But three of the so-called, anger and fear are coded masculine, right? And so, and that's kind of a cliche as well. And then, one of the ways that her kind of emotional development is read is that she's sort of on her way to becoming increasingly normative, right? That at the end of this, her emotional range is going to look like her mother's or something like that, right? That she's on her way to that kind of pattern. And, and this might be really disappointing when we think about the formulation of the family. I mean, it's nice to see them sort of caring for each other, but once again, the emotional labor, her dad has just sort of started a new job, and, she's asked to be the happy girl. Her mother's very proud of this. They need to, her mother said something about they need to be, sort of strong or supportive for their father, right? So once again, you have this formulation of the emotional labor falling on the mother and the daughter, and this is part of the, Riley's problem, right, is that she can't actually be happy, but she's not given the space to kind of grieve. And so that's the kind of, dynamic that's set up there.
That's interesting. And actually, even the kind of the start of the movie sets up this you're talking about a father's vision of a daughter rather than a daughter itself. Why would an 11-year-old girl have only experienced joy or predominantly joy up until this moment in her life, and then the thing that does it is the move? Actually, I thought about that even when, I said it a minute ago, like when she comes into the world and joy is what arrives. Well, I don't think any clinical psychologist would necessarily agree with that kind of statement. I think we know exactly about the emotional state of a newly arrived child, but there's huge trauma and anxiety and concern at all levels of life, right? And actually, what that's subscribing to is a very romantic with a capital R view of childhood as this blissful, inhibited experience of pure joy and freedom before the trappings of the adult world and socialization come in, and then things get more complicated and they become more uniform. So actually, there is this imposed romanticism of childhood into adolescence that the film is kind of guilty of indulging. Because really, actually, I'm sure 11-year-olds, it's all about a question of context, isn't it? You feel great sadness and joy and contempt and anger against whatever you're feeling in life, because that's the tapestry.
I was thinking about Eric's point of the uniformity of the parents' feelings, both in design. There's it's clear through colour, maybe, which and I can't remember exactly the design, but there is a distinctiveness, but also the fact that all the males wear the moustache and things like this. But they're more uniform. They seem to be more in control. We need to feel this now, given the eye contact. So it's all very more procedural and well worn. And again, going back to your initial points about kind of Wally, actually, it's a lot more programmed. Riley's gone off the rails, or has yet to find the rails, whereas the parents are very in tune with their emotions and emotionally mature and able to, or through the way that the emotions are presented in the bodies. Contrast that with both Riley, but also talk about normativity, the young boy who sort of stares at the end at Riley's and it's just like girl, which is my favourite bit of the movie. Actually, the last 10 minutes of the movie I think are great, actually. They're no good dinosaur, but they're great. But there's just something around it that, I don't know. It does some interesting things, and I think the comparison with the young boy who's just driven by desire,
And that can be more permissible, right? Because you wouldn't say,
Riley wouldn't have boy.
The mother doesn't say, if the film's about a male 11-year-old, the mother doesn't say to him, "You got to keep smiling for daddy," and expect, and if she does, she doesn't expect him to actually do it, right? But this is the tragedy is that this sweet girl, in quotation marks, is becoming less sweet. She's being ruled by anger and these other sort of emotions that she's perfectly entitled to feel.
Yeah.
I must confess the parents didn't come across this well in this viewing.
Second time, yeah.
Seem to have no appreciation for this is quite a traumatic thing for an 11-year-old to go through, and maybe don't try and make sure that at least some stuff's there before you arrive and all that kind of stuff, right? That's the worst parental advice I've heard for, don't just keep smiling, keep happy, or and that burden they place on her, right?
I mean, like so many films that are meant to include younger audiences or whatever, the parents, are not presented in a good light, right? They make mistakes, they make errors, and, the young person kind of suffers for it. And so, at the end of this one, the parents seem to have learned a lesson. They've, sort of neglected Riley in this sense. But I think this ranges a broader point of, the acceptability of a range of emotions in children.
Sure.
Rather than viewing, their anger, their sadness, or whatever as somehow disorderly and a problem.
Yeah.
So I have a couple of things that I have in my notes that I'd be interested in. One is a kind of very famous scene, I think about 40 minutes in, where the characters, and you gestured towards this earlier on, where they kind of fragment, which I think is, I've certainly used it, I was saying to you before we started, in my animation classes to talk about, that's animation in a nutshell. It's non-objective fragmentation, deconstruction. We're two-dimensional, and then they're non-figurative. And it's I show that as in a class on actually animation and queerness, but it's really about, they look a bit like stop motion figures at one point, then they become experimental figures, but they begin as three-dimensional computer animated film figures. So I thought that's a nice little way of thinking about animation aesthetics, I guess. And on the topic of aesthetics, I was struck this time about how there were shifts in camera work. So when Riley is this right, that when she escapes, I mean, there are ways in which her sadness or her depression, let's say depression, is signified. It's through colour. Her costume changes from really colourful to kind of a grey scale throughout, and she sort of starts to wear really muted colours and then returns to colour at the end. But there are bits where when she's running for the bus, or it kind of shifts to this handheld camera work, or this, I don't know, I was really struck by that. It reminds me of the bit in WALL-E where the shopping trolleys crash together and suddenly the camera refocuses and you're like, am I watching this through another WALL-E's eyes? But I thought there was a shift there was something quite regular and proper and live actiony, let's say, about the setups in the world or in Riley's mind.
Yeah, no, I agree that that's there. And I mean, I always found that because that's cross-cut with like the console or the control panel like turning black, right?
Yes.
And so, and then she's like on her phone. I think her mother's calling her or something like that. She's hanging up. So yeah, there's these shots that are kind of tight on Riley.
Yes.
And what I was thinking about when you were saying that is how that kind of tight, shot and the color scheme change, how much that is in contrast to the world inside the mind, which is so capacious and vast. You have these like sublime shots of that whole world. And towards the end of the film, we get kind of something that's clearly oppositional to that, right? So to me, I feel like that speaks to the themes of the film, to the narrative, where things are going, to sort of have that kind of different focus there. So I don't know.
Yeah, but I think we've hit on it in that because there's no consciousness and there's no conscience, so there's no ethics in this, or there's no kind of
she shouldn't be doing this, or she shouldn't be getting on the bus. That's left to the other emotions to kind of express.
Well, yeah, they do express it. They sort of do it indirectly whilst being these emotions, but there's no force or visualization of a force of just kind of I don't know. Maybe it depends on how you define ethics, but a kind of post-Kantian cerebral, ethics of will, or an ethics.
Well,
I'm
tapping out.
An ethics of any kind of like intellect is not offered, right?
Yeah,
it's all it's emotional ethics. Feeling good, not necessarily joyful, but feeling okay is the only ethical consideration to be worried about. The idea that you can feel bad and do something good isn't really offered as a solution in this film.
What I'm thinking about is sort of saying this on one level, and this is prompted by something, quote from Pete Docter that is in one of the sort of paratexts of the film, which is that he sort of says he's interested in doing this project because it's this is such an abstract thing to represent emotions, and so I feel like there's like a deliberate interest in all things like abstract, and so for that reason abstract thought and sort of the confusion between like facts and opinions, this is as close as we get to kind of a faculty of reason, and instead the emotions are sort of they're kind of as close as we get to sort of any kind of reason component that's really just not there.
the idea being that the idea in the film being that these there is no pure reason, or there is no pure, which I guess is probably true, but or like there's an argument to be made for that kind of, that is quite a modernist assumption of that, don't worry, we'll be able to strip away all these emotions and think clearly. In a way, maybe is the film offering, it's saying, well, that's not a possibility, or is it just not really thinking about that force in the world?
I guess one of the things I'm resistant to is like to read it as sort of Riley learning to self-regulate and to be an agent, to gain some sense of autonomy. Like, that's boring to me. I don't really want to.
Why is that boring? That's interesting. But why is that boring? Why is it? It's interesting to me that that's boring. Why is that boring?
For something for the film to be about.
Because it just seems obvious, or
maybe that's why it's boring.
Yeah.
Like that, I think that's why it's boring. I mean, the autonomous subject, the individual. This is so kind of ideologically obvious for most contexts, definitely in the U.S. context. That I'm like, well, yeah, she's learning to regulate her emotions. She's learning to be a kind of agent with some self-control. So what's more interesting to me is actually before any of that resolution happens. Like, I'm interested when she's embarrassed. Yeah, and she's like feeling really strange. The emotions are out of whack. Everything's off balance. She gets depressed. She, can't self-regulate, and she has a different configuration of personality. That's where like something interesting and radical is happening. Yeah. Right. And that's where maybe she's at her kind of most unusual. I don't know if she's necessarily queer in those moments, but definitely not like normative, and she's not being accepted by her peers around her, and she's like kind of navigating the world in a very different way. She's seeing the world in a different way, and so to me, that's interesting. And and I always think, I'm like, what would it have meant if they did have like embarrassment as a character, since that's like the end of the first act, that like kind of sets the action up. And they don't. Instead, I think what conveys the sense of embarrassment is the inside and outside effect. Yeah. Right. She can't see into her own mind. She doesn't have that control. She can't, relate to the people around her. She's totally isolated. She's like kind of cut off. She's like self-aware that she doesn't have control of her emotions. And so there's a real like, I guess in a philosophical register, it's like when you take yourself as an object, when you reflect on yourself, and you kind of don't find there's much there. You kind of like, well, I guess I'm, I consist of my family and my friends and, all these things that I don't really control. Yeah. Right? There's something to that kind of like self-reflection that doesn't find a stable subject, an autonomous subject there.
And I guess that reading is supported by the kind of, the messiness of the world building, the fracture, the fact that we can't quite pin together all these disparate zones and lands. And actually what a lot of the human mind seems to is just empty space and vast, and the emptiness of all
the negative space,
is as important to kind of the way the film thinks these things through, or allows us to offer a way of thinking those things through.
Yeah, we didn't get it. I mean, we haven't talked about space, but I think that would be, kind of an interesting topic, because it's so important to the sort of metaphor of the mind, is this sort of vast space. And it reminds me of how often, computer animated films are reflective of kind of, whether it's a database logic or something, massive, the technological sublime, right? That kind of thing, seems to be in the world that's built there inside the mind, right?
Right. Yeah. Interesting.
The just as you were talking, thinking about when she's embarrassed, is that just before joy and sadness get sucked out of the mind? Because I feel like that's it. They're watching her be embarrassed, and that's I think joy and sadness are in the mind. That scene, because that almost feels like that's one of those rare instances. No, sorry.
No, you're right. I was just agreeing. Yes, you're right, because what happens is she recalls a core memory that's joyful, and then because of the new context she's in, it becomes sad, and that's what causes her to cry, and that's what.
But then so that's an interesting instance where it feels like Riley is controlling the actions, and so it's because she becomes embarrassed, and that changes, that sets off a chain of events where joy and sadness get sucked out of the mind. So that's an interesting example where Riley's in control, somehow independent of her emotions, because her emotions are going, I don't know what's happening here.
Yeah, right, because Joy starts the scene in the classroom. Yeah. And the whole bit is that Joy loses control as there's a scuffle.
But Joy loses control, but that control doesn't go to any of the other emotions in there. It somehow goes to Riley, who is now independent of all of the people inside her mind.
And that's when she's at her most self-conscious.
Yeah, so I think you're right. Embarrassment and self-consciousness, and perhaps in a different version of the film, interesting things like kind of sexuality, because it's interesting at the minute where her emotions are in check, she meets a boy at the end. As if, like, when your emotions are in check, here comes sexuality.
Yeah, you're ready to couple.
Yeah, you're ready to couple. We're in normative mode now. Let's go. But I just thought that's a striking moment where somehow Riley's now operating independent of anyone controlling the control panels. Your computer's gone AWOL. It's all over the place, and suddenly the emotions are now trying to play catch up with her, and that causes them to expend from joy and sadness to expend the mind and go kind of elsewhere into the long-term memories, the armory of long-term memories. But issues of control and agency, I think, are knotted throughout the film. But equally, it's the film. I guess my final question is actually what I was going to ask you, based on your first comment, was: do you actually think the film is radical? Then, because you use the word radical, because it's often cited as Pixar's. We've got budding movie. We've got, where are we up to now? And maybe your point, Alex, is about the kind of golden age of Pixar. So this is 2015. We've had, so up is 2009. We've had Toy Story 2. We've had Toy Story 3. We've had Cars 2, 2011. We've had Brave. We've had, well, I can't remember. I think we're now on to, I think the next one is Inside Out and Good Dinosaur. And it feels like Inside Out was held up as a Pixar doing something really different now. This is really, we're inside the mind. But it seems like it's not perhaps as radical as we might think, because it's more interested in the boring bits.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think maybe it stands out from Pixar's oeuvre in the sense that instead of their, and I know, Christy, I think you've written about this, right, where instead of there being an emphasis on like the toyness or carness or ratness of a character, these are abstract emotions, right? And so there's just, they lack that kind of groundedness. And so that seems to me to stand out a little bit from some of the other films. But again, I just think about, like the return to stasis or equilibrium at the end. It's not a radically reconfigured world. No. Yeah. Right? I just think about the end of Ratatouille, where there's just a serious reconfiguration of relationships. Right? It is very, that's pretty radical.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Right. With this one, not so much.
No, you're right.
I realised the one I forgot was Monsters University, perhaps for obvious reasons, but that was, so Pixar had made Up, Toy Story 3, this was kind of in, I guess what you're saying, Alex, with regards to this cycle.
I'd like to take that back. I've decided I'd like to take that back.
No.
Because what I'm doing is doing the thing I hate, which is like, let's periodise it like in a qualitative manner, or it's a bit messier than that, because there's been some good and some bad across the whole period.
Certainly,
and who am I to say what's good and bad?
Certainly, Disney's acquisition of Pixar has often been considered to reverse the polarities. So Pixar are now making more sequels, Disney are making more original films, and it's the kind of the fallow post.
But I would challenge a narrative that says sequels are worse than originals. I'd rather it just be good, and only you, the listener, can decide what is good and what is bad. So
I'll just mention Monsters University again. But
except Monsters University.
I think the point that Eric's made is regard to a cycle of films where you have Toy Story 3, so you have a sequel, Cars 2 sequel, you have Brave. Which was seen as the sort of Disney-fied princess narrative, Monsters University sequel, and then we have Inside Out, and often Pixar's films are talked about as an original story or so and so. And I do remember a lot of the stuff around Inside Out and Good Dinosaur being released that's Inside Out first in June, Good Dinosaur in November. Good Dinosaur being the problem one, the more traditional, familiar one, and Inside Out being the slightly more radical one before we went back into two more sequels, Finding Dory and Cars 3. So it's one of the ones that's often held up as quite kind of different and doing kind of something different. But I think it does stand out, even though it follows some of the other beats of other Pixar films. It's at least trying to do something kind of slightly different.
However, we managed to get an hour or so out of that, didn't we?
Like, we did.
It's obviously a film that can offer points of conversation and points of reflection, and that's always I mean, I guess to students and things, I always like, I really like what you said when I asked you about like the why is that boring? Because I think being interested in the bits you're interested in and not interested in is a really important part of the process of interpretation that we sometimes neglect when we're kind of just because the film is interested in the ending, if we can even make such a claim, doesn't mean we have to be,
I teach my students similarly. Like one of the things, and this was in my book, is to really take aesthetic experience seriously. Yeah. And so when you watch a film and you have your reactions, which moments did you actually react to? What was, what you liked and disliked. That's actually a decent starting point in reality. And because that's where kind of different breaks happen. So yeah, the resolution of Inside Out, not so much. But when she's crying in class and things go haywire, that's interesting.
Yeah. And what's the interpretive process you kind of want to pursue? I think it's not an invalid. Like what's more fun and what's more interesting to examine here, rather than what should I examine? I think the first question is much more productive. So in a way, we're all ruled by our emotions, even us. I can't believe I just did that. Right, the end. Right. So Eric, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me. It was wonderful.
No, it was really, really fun to chat to you. And yeah, I don't know. We'll have to do the Good Dinosaur, won't we? Because then you're all sharp about it.
We will be doing the Good Dinosaur.
Another time, though. Your book is still available if people want to buy it. Remind us of what it's called, and people can get it on
Pixar and the Aesthetic Imagination. I'm sure you can find it.
I've got it. Don't look at me. I've got it. Yeah.
It's good. Yeah, I was rereading it last night and I couldn't get too far because I was.
You used the word sharp.
Yeah, I was getting intimidated, so I had to put it down. So,
what are you kind of working on at the moment? What are some of your kind of interests, or where you're kind of going post Pixar and the aesthetic imagination?
Well, I've been thinking about this. Because I sort of have to, as an academic, we're expected to do this kind of thing. And I don't know.
There's an emotion for you. Pressure.
But this conversation really has me thinking, and I was thinking about where we started this conversation with, which is about allegory. Mm-hmm. And I think that might be a kind of interesting thing to pursue if certain kinds of animated films or animation styles lend themselves to allegory in a particular way. Again, this conversation was interesting because we were talking about like subject formation, how a person becomes a person, whether it's through emotions. And this is sort of an allegory about that. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's something I'm going to think more about and see if there are other films that do that, maybe in different ways, other animations that kind of do that. And then the other thing that, I'm going to be working on is, I think I'm going to write a little bit about animation and philosophy. And so if you have ideas about that.
Or listeners, if you have
ideas, that would be great, because I'm trying to figure that out. I've read philosophy, regularly, and I come across philosophers using animation concepts or concepts that resemble animation. And then there's, animation studies scholars who kind of refer to philosophy. And then I'm sure, I haven't met any yet, but I'm sure I'm going to find them, animators who think their practice is a form of philosophy. And so that's kind of an investigation that I'm starting at the moment now.
Great stuff.
Fascinating. Sign me up. I'll read it all. It sounds really, really great, and I'm looking forward to seeing the work out when it's available. But don't fall to pressure. Just continue doing the work, I think, is probably what we all need to do right now. All right. That's been us for another episode. We will see you in a few weeks. In the meantime, if you want to read more about some of the stuff we talked about, you can find it at fancy-animation.org, where you can take part in the blog. If you've got something you want to say, click the Contact Us tab and fill out the form. Take part in the conversations more informally on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at FanAnimResearch, FANANIM Research, and fananimresearch@gmail.com is the way that you can ask us or commission us to do a quick footnote episode. You want to talk about animation's ability to represent metaphor, allegory. There's loads of footnotes in that episode. There's a whole index that we could call from. But let us know if any particularly stood out. Otherwise, that's been us, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.